Chapter 8. A second to breathe, please. David and Ashley stepped into the entrance with the scarred man. His head was shaved, but you could see small hair sprouting, making out the hairline he had, and the lack thereof in the places it had gone naturally bald some time ago. He wore a black short-sleeved collared suit with denim jeans and worn work boots. Overall, nothing out of the ordinary, just a standard outfit for a charge station clerk. He took them to the back of the shop. David noticed there was no one else in the place except a younger woman. Her hair was blonde, but it was dirty and relatively unkempt. She wore glasses and a matching charge station collared shirt and yoga pants. She looked up as the scarred man walked David and Ashley by. "Some new wayward souls, Jason?" asked the little blonde. "Lost little rats washed away in the stream of shit the world put them in," said the deep, hard-voiced man. Jason? For some reason, that name stood out to David, but in that moment, he couldn't place it. His body's pain was finally winning the game of tug-of-war it had been playing with his mind, not to mention the constant ache from the headache he had been dealing with ever since lunch. They made it to the back, and the blonde had stopped stocking the shelves and walked past them. The man turned around to face them. "You stop here. Don't matter what I think of you two, but procedure is what keeps the world behind that door alive," he said to them. "What procedure and what world is that?" asked Ashley. She had a more determined look on her face after she had smashed a bottle against the long-haired thug's face earlier. David was somewhat relieved to see that she was returning to form again. "Until we know more about what the fuck you want and are doing here, it's none of your fucking business," the man said. David wanted to try to lighten up the shift in mood as best he could. "So, Jason, right? I'm David and that—" The man interrupted him. "I know your name, kid." Nothing more said until the procedure. David felt a shiver down his spine. He knows my name, David thought. Listening to Jason's instructions, David knew it was time he shut his mouth, standing there in all his aching misery and anticipation for the procedure. About 2 minutes later, the young blonde came back out with a strange-looking device and began working with it. She went over both David and Ashley with the thing a couple times. David watched as the scarred man, Jason, began growing impatient. "What's taking so long?" he asked her. "Well, Trace hasn't shown me how to use it properly and you sent him off. Plus, usually you don't want us just jumping right to this part. Why are we doing it this way with these two?" she asked, with a slight bitterness in her voice as she eyed up David and Ashley with a predetermined accusation. "Because it's my fucking shop. They ain't seen or heard nothing from anybody. If it comes down to it and they are chem rats, I don't see Trace or Gil having a problem icing them if I said so." Ashley spoke up before David could form a rebuttal to the idea of being killed. "If chemrat is your way of calling us informants, it's a damn lie. We just ran for our lives from 2 SDT agents. It even caused a major traffic jam. It had to be on the news," she declared, as the girl went over her with the device. The little girl paused again and looked over at old man she called Jason. "I'm not fucking Trace. It's hard to read this crap, but I'm pretty sure the indicator is supposed to flip if they lie, and it didn't. I also don't see any tech attached to them, both inside and out. No wires," she told him. "All right, it'll have to do. I don't want them out in the open right now anyways," he spoke. The young girl opened her mouth. She clearly wasn't afraid to say her piece to the man like the thugs outside were. Just because they say they were being chased and the news spoke about the jam, you want to believe them. What if it's like some deep fake or something? You always say better vetted than played, she yelled at him. His eyes broke from David's and shot a piercing glance at the teenage girl. "Who the fuck has been in this game for 30 years and who the fuck has been in it since last goddamn school semester? Sit the fuck down behind that register and play your part. Consider it an order if it'll shut your mouth." She went off in a huff, and as she walked away, put on a pair of ancient-looking headphones, meaning they had a wire that attached itself to a CD player. It was the strangest thing David had seen a teenager do today. Nowadays, kids have access to the Plugged Ear Plus, brought to them by the good folks at Census Tech, or a wide variety of music-enabling devices that could use the power of modern-day achievements. The old man watched her for a moment to make sure she went behind the register, then opened the backroom door. "In," he said simply to the two of them. They walked in, David behind Ashley and the man behind him. The back room was smaller than David anticipated for a different world. 3 desks in either corner, one with a big stack of papers on it. Not just any papers, but old-style newspapers. That in itself was wild to David. It was like they entered this shop and fell back 50 years or more in time. The other desk was covered in wrappers, fast food bags, and half-eaten slop, as well as big gulp cups from this charge station. It also had a computer on it. It was a much older-looking computer, which was not surprising to David considering everything else at this point. The last desk was the cleanest one. It had a coffee mug, a few of the newspapers neatly stacked on one another, and a few other files or something to the effect. "How did you know my name, man?" asked David, ready to get to the quick of it. "I know both of you." The man replied as straightforward as David had been with him. "I know her name and face because she comes here more than any other Chembal user. She pays with a card, so I've seen her name. Based off her frequent visitation to a less than desirable charge station, we did some digging on her." He looked Ashley hard in the face as he spoke about her, and she, although tired, was clearly not happy to hear someone else, besides the SDT, had invaded her privacy. "So, because I came around to charge my car up, you decide to invade my privacy?" she asked, with a curt and aggressive tone in her voice. The man laughed, full-on laughter which made David jump with a shock he wasn't expecting. "Your privacy?" He mocked her in his laughing fit. "You think your life is private? What a joke. Look at the shit you post online. Take a look at the medical files that can be accessed with a joke of a firewall, just so they can make sure the vegheads can do their jobs and still be a member of society. You want to talk about invading privacy? You left that pipe dream at the door the moment you took their money. The moment you went to preschool. The moment you went to college. The moment you took their fucking pills. Privacy died a long time ago for someone like you." His words came barreling at them like a truck that wouldn't stop. "Yeah, we dug into the world of Ashley Madison Ivy. I wanted to know what was making you a regular here. You know what I found? You were a fucking tourist. You have been prescribed by the doctor you see every 3 months a healthy dose of 2 Chembal pills per dosage. Based off our very simple and easy recon, have only been taking one of those 2 pills per dose for a good long while. You enjoy bending rules. You enjoy being right up on the line so you can see all the shit on the other side. But you wouldn't go stepping in it unless something came and wrecked your little world." His eyes shot to David as he said that part. "I gotta say, though, I didn't think it would have been David that wrecked into it. How do you know my goddamn name?" David was tired, in pain, and angry. This old dude was taking pot shots at Ashley and him, and not giving anything in return. He wanted answers, and he wanted a rest so he could think about the next step forward clearly. "We came here looking for someone named Nex. Where are they?" he demanded. The scarred man looked at him with a hard expression, then finally said, "You look like him, besides the eye color and hair. That's Joyce." His words confused David, but in the same vein made sense. "Look like who?" he said between gritted teeth. The scarred man answered in his deep, hard voice, not making David wait too long for a response. "Michael Nash, your father." The mention of his father's name and the day's events wearing him was finally getting to be too much. The revelation that this man was claiming to know his father, and even saying his name, hit David harder than anything that had today. His legs buckled slightly, and he leaned his back against the door. He could feel cold sweat pouring out of his back and his forehead as he fought the pressure of faintness. David had never fainted in his life, but this was the closest he thought he had ever been to it. He found it hard to even make words form as he stood there staring at the man with a glazed-over stare. He couldn't get the words to form. Thankfully, Ashley could, and it seemed she had the same line of thought, or could read David's. "How do you know who his father is?" she asked, trying to find some ground to form control of this conversation for her and David. But before the man could answer, David thought about the black notebook left behind by his father. The one he left in the car with the gun and knife. That was stupid, since those thugs took it off to God knows where. But in the notebook, his father mentioned 3 other names: Eddie, Vance, and Jason. David, in a rugged, exhausted voice, said, "You're Jason." The man stared at David hard and simply followed up with, "Yeah, I'm Jason. And up until you were about 6, I knew you." David was in utter shock, and Ashley was at a loss. David simply looked at her, trying to think of how to say all he had to say, then flipped back to Jason. "I left a notebook, a gun, and a knife in that car." It was still hard for him to stand and speak at the same time, but he managed it. Jason looked at him and said, "Is it important?" "Yes," David said limply. Jason nodded his head once. "Fine. Anything else in the car needed from either of you? If I make a call to Gil, I want it to be one call, understood?" Both Ashley and David shook their heads. Besides those 3 items, there was nothing else in the car they wanted. Jason pulled an old, thick phone from the corner of his desk and dialed a number. It rang for a few moments before a voice on the other line came through. "Sup?" was greeted from the other end of the line. Jason replied shortly himself. "The car. What's the situation there?" "About to deep six it like you said," the voice said on the line. It wasn't the weasel's voice. That meant it had to the one Jason called Gil. "There's a notepad, a ranged gun, and a knife. Grab 'em. Bring 'em back with you. Otherwise, finish that gig quick." "Noted," the voice said simply. Jason hung up. He looked up at Ashley and David. "It's an old-school burner phone. Not such an easy track since they rely on old radio signals and shit. Got to go through the gray market to get it, but it helps when you got people out there who know they still need to make 'em for us." He looked around and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look," he said, "I know you want to ask questions and shit. All that ring-around crap that happens the first time someone gets chewed up for wanting a moment to breathe like a real human in this world. But you two really look like shit. Kinda smell like it too. If you want, I can give you a quick rundown of what kind of situation you are in, and then after you take some time to rest up, I can give you more details. Deal?" David and Ashley both nodded in unison instantly. Jason was right. They were tired, dirty, and hurt. "All right, the short version. It's all a big lie, all the cliché crap you think you heard before in vids or movies or whatever. Even those silly holodeck stories where you go up against a foreign corrupt leader. Except it's not a story or some conspiracy theory joke. Kids like me, your dad, and friends from school, we all helped give them more. Every time the government sent off another wave of kids to go kill some group of newly minted baddies, it was really the corporations and whoever the fuck runs them telling us to go give them more. Every time more and more are taken. Now you are some kind of freak if you don't want to be plugged into every new device they throw A+ name tag on. You're a freak if you don't want to drug up or have your kids drugged up. The truth is, this little organization is here to disrupt, confront, and find out the truth. We don't know much about our enemies other than we know they want the world to think we are terrorists and that we are a small fraction of the population. You want to find Nex? I hate to break it to you, but Nex isn't some game breaker with all the answers. When did I go to meet Nex all those years ago with Eddie, Vance, and your dad? It was just some former military dude whose legs got blown off in his deployment. He died of an overdose about 20 years ago. I'm Nex now, but I'm the only Nex here in this city. There's a Nex in at least every state. All we do is deal with information and help get others in the organization to where they want to go. The name Nex just means nexus. What do you know? Ashley asked. David would have asked too, but the idea that this guy, this man who knew his father and fought with him, was the all-knowing mystical Nex figure, and all it really meant was he was an information hub, it seemed so futile he couldn't believe this was what he had found in his race to learn the truth. The truth was, nobody knew anything. We know this is something that has been in the works for a while, at least since the 20th century. We know Chembal is used to keep the masses from looking at everything too hard. But you must be able to work. They need you to work. We know that much is very important to them. We know if you take too much, you become a veghead. At which point, they will send you off for reassignment. We know re-education turns you into some near-lost airhead, but you can still do some work. We lost a lot of people over the years to reassignment, your father being one of them. David broke in at the mention of his father being reassigned. What or where do they do this? This reassignment stuff? Jason just shook his head. We know when someone is set up to be reassigned, they get shipped off to those PowerPlants, the places that power most of the world's tech. But we never have been able to get someone in and out. If someone goes into a power plant, we don't see them again. We think they are being used as slave labor for the plants. But we don't know much else. The night your father and Eddie were captured, they were planning to go to a plant. But the team they had got busted. The fallout was bad. Only one person on the team escaped the ambush. She hid. then followed the SDT team to a power plant and watched them walk the others in. After that, the SDT came along and re-educated all the spouses and families of the 4 that got popped. Your mom was one of them, while they deemed you too young to need re-education. What power plant was he taken to? Is he still there? Is he alive? David asked, horrified at what he might hear, and angry that no one ever tried to get him out. We don't know, David. When he went in with the other 3, that was the last we ever saw of him. We suspect that they may rotate them around to the other plants, but we don't know how or when. We don't know the living conditions for the people there either. If it's bad enough, they may die after too long, which explains why they can run so many people into the plants. Jason looked at a clock. Look, the history lesson must be put on pause. I'll take you down to the basement apartment. It's a hidden area of the building. There's running water, a bed, and some other basic things down there. Rest up, eat, shower for Christ's sake. Tomorrow, we will pick this up. I still have work to get done today. He took David and Ashley over to a wall, touched a small break in the panel and removed it. Behind the wall was a door. He pulled it open and led them down a section of old stairs. Once they were down to the bottom, a second door was opened by Jason. He led them in as he flipped a light switch. He wasn't kidding. It was a small basement apartment. The kitchen and front room were a combined floor area. A small old TV faced an old cheap love seat. The kitchen had a microwave and a small fridge, a bathroom and small bedroom with a cheap queen-sized futon. Welcome to the rest stop. Take advantage while you can. There's a burner phone on the counter there. In the drawer is an updated contact to the one on my desk. Call if you need something. Oh, and in the drawer is some Tylenol as well. Coming off Chembal leaves you with an ear-splitting headache. You'll need it. He turned around and left them standing alone in the small apartment. There was a moment where nothing was said between the two of them. They stood in the silence, covered in the weathered clothes and scraps and cuts. They listened in motionless silence to the sounds of Jason's footsteps as he went back up to the charge station. David had nothing to say. He was spent. The day and the revelations that came with it was nearly too much. Although, in its own way, it had been a rewarding day. The morning where everything seemed so mundane and ordinary. Waking up beside Ashley and preparing for the day, going to work humming a song, getting there, and sitting in the silence of the empty work he did. Then the afternoon came and changed all of that. Those agents, the fire alarm he raised to escape, conning Simon to help him, then watching Simon get tranked. That part was kind of funny when he thought back on Simon's face when the dart hit his arm. They ran through the office as it rained down old water. The buff SDT agent that nearly caught him in the chase. The fat one shooting at him. The car ride to his apartment, his father's box, the car chase. Then the charge station fights with the weasel and the guy with crooked teeth. All the way to Jason, who was someone who knew his father before he was reassigned to God knows where. Oh yeah, and he was next. The person who wasn't anything more than a title given to someone in an area that acted as a nexus point for an organization of what? Rebels? Wannabe rebels? All fighting against the big bad government who was bought and owned by shady giant corporations. Corporations with some strange motive to make people take pills and work hard so they would buy their newest products. It all seemed so strange, so unreal. David himself wouldn't even have believed it had it not been for all this crap that went down. Ashley was the one that finally became animated. She moved forward into the room, looking at it up and down. She looked over at David. Her cheeks were still covered in her eye makeup from the fire sprinklers and her own tears. Her form-fitting professional casual dress had somehow, in all the drama, went from a white cream color that bounced off her tan skin to some dirty, spotty thing. Her feet were cut and bruised as well since she wore high heels to work that day and had to remove them during the escape. Then she smiled at him and said, "It's not quite an impenetrable fortress, but at least it's just ours for the night." David put on a weak half-smile as he tried to think of what to say in reply. Then, without realizing it all, he let out, "I'm sorry I dragged you into this. This all is my fault. If I hadn't dug for answers on our databases, I shouldn't have asked you to get involved. I shouldn't have fled, and I should never have drugged you along for the ride." She moved over to him with determination in her eyes. "You didn't make me do anything. I could have told you to stop sticking your nose in those things. I could have said I wouldn't be a part of it either. The truth is, David, I wanted to know too. I never understood it until 3 weeks ago, but something in the back of my mind always wanted me to ask. It wasn't until someone else asked that I knew I wasn't alone. You saved me in that office." Her response lifted the weight of his chest with such relief, he felt his shoulders drop from the pressure that was removed. "I just didn't want you to hate me. I have hated everyone and everything, even when I didn't even know what hate was. Then you came along, and if you hated me, the one person I didn't hate, then none of it would have been worth it." Of all the things he was unsure of, this was the one thing he knew, without a doubt. Ashley was the first person in his life that made him question how things stand and where he was in his life. As David saw it, she was the reason he finally took the time to learn who exactly his father was. That should really mean something after all. It did. It meant everything. David made his way to the bathroom to take a shower. He flipped the light on. It was small and old-looking. It was clear this bathroom was built for function, not for anything else. He turned the water on in the shower to let it warm up, questioning if it even would. David turned to the mirror to take a quick look at himself. His hair was ruffled up from the day's events. Apparently, the activities of the day resulted in a shiner under his left eye, and as he thought about everything that happened, he couldn't pinpoint where or when that could have occurred. But there it was, as well as a small cut and bruise on the middle of his forehead, where his head met the bridge of the weasel's nose earlier. He had his end of the day, 5 o'clock shadow growing, and he looked around the small bathroom hoping for a razor to clean up. No razors meant he wouldn't be able to shave. He would have to ask Jason next time he saw him for one. He took off his flannel work shirt and looked at his side for the first time. A wide, deep bruise had developed on the right side of his ribcage, where the big agent had plowed into him in the office. He looked down at his knuckles. His right hand's knuckles had swollen some and were cut and red. It hurt to flex his fingers open and shut, but he didn't think they were broken. As David removed his pants and underwear, he saw that his knee was also red from when it made contact with the weasel's face in the parking lot of the charge station. He got in the shower. It wasn't cold, but it was far from steamy warm. It was at that annoying room temperature, where he wasn't going to freeze, but it also wasn't going to be the nice hot shower that opens up the pores and leaves you feeling revitalized. He stood there in the water for a moment, letting it wash away some of the day's events. Then the curtain opened slightly, and Ashley joined in. She winced at the water's temperature. "Yeah, that's what I figured. No way I'm going to wait. By the time you get done, there would be zero warm water whatsoever." For the first 15 minutes or so, they went back and forth in the small shower, letting one another clean themselves off with what little warm water there was. Each time they switched spots, they had to rub up against one another, which at least for David was beginning to take his mind off everything else. He thought mentally about how well put together she was, in every sense it seemed. After she removed the final spots of soap from her body, she turned to face him, moving in close. David put his hands on her hips, and they both moved into kisses. As they stood in silence aside from the water raining down on them, he moved his hands down lower. Ashley put her hands on his sides, and the sudden shock of pain left him gasping. Ashley quickly pulled her hands away and looked down at his right ribcage. "It looks bad, David. Does it hurt to breathe or move?" she asked him. "Only a little bit now. It was worse in the car," he replied. He really did not want something as silly as his ribs to kill the mood. She studied the bruise a second longer, then looked up at him. "After the shower, we should maybe look to see if they are broken or just bruised." "No doubt," he said, "but let's not let that take away from this lovely and eloquent shower," he said with a smile. She laughed as they both moved in close to one another again. They stayed in the shower well after the water went from tepid to cold. However, the temperature of the water could not deter them from the physical release they both eagerly sought. After they had cleaned up and found some old musty clothes in the bedroom dresser, she examined his ribs while they sat on the bed. Ashley was by no means a doctor, but she had a good idea what the feeling of broken bones would feel like. She began applying gentle pressure to the bruised area. As she pressed down in certain spots, fresh pain welled up inside David, causing him to gasp for breath, and at one point resulted in David punching his left palm with his right fist. His swollen and cut palm screamed, creating just another layer of pain. After feeling his ribs for what seemed like forever, she finally stopped. "I didn't feel anything that felt like a break. I think it's just a bad bruise." A couple days and it won't be so bad. David looked down at her feet and reached for her right foot. He studied it and took note of the cuts and bruises on soles of her feet. Does any of this hurt really bad? He asked, thinking to himself how stupid of a question was that. Of course, it probably hurt. It's mostly just stiff and achy at this point. Getting off my feet has been nice, she replied. David applied some light pressure and she let out a sigh of pure joy. They eventually passed out in the futon in each other's arms and slept for a very long time. David woke up around 9:15 a.m. the next day. He had been asleep for nearly 10 hours. Ashley stayed asleep as he moved out of the bed quietly. He went to the dresser and found a pair of denim jeans. They were meant for someone with a fatter ass. But a belt he found in the tiny excuse of a closet helped keep them up. He made his way to the main room of the apartment. He found the phone on the counter, and in the drawer, found the contact number left for them to call if they needed anything. He punched in the number and listened to the sound of the phone ringing. Jason answered. Nex, his voice came out in its hard and deep manner. It's David, David said simply. What do you need? Asked Jason. Is it cool for me to come up? I still have questions about, well, I guess everything, David said. There was a moment of pause. Then Jason spoke. Anna, take the register. Don't fucking complain. Just do it. Come up to the office. Then he hung up. David made his way to the door, stopped, left a note on the counter for Ashley to let her know where he went, then went up the stairs. As he came out of the wall, Jason was already behind his desk. He was reading one of the newspapers and smoking a cigarette. David sat down opposite him, looking at the cigarette, wishing he could have one of his ritualistic morning smokes. Jason looked up at him from the paper. Want one? It's a gray market brand. So it's an actual cigarette, not that clean Nick or Nick clean crap they peddle to the chem dogs and veg heads. David nodded and thankfully took the cigarette, lit it with Jason's lighter, and took a long drag like he would have with any other cigarette. But this was not one of those artificial cigarettes he had been smoking. It was an actual one, and the moment the smoke filled his lungs, he exploded with a coughing fit. Jason snickered at him. I love that part. When someone thinks that shit, they peddle is real, and then they take a hit of a real tobacco nicotine cig. Everyone always ends up in a coughing fit, Jason said with a smile on his face that David thought could appropriately be deemed a shit-eating grin. As he wiped the tears from his eyes and collected himself, he took another, more tentative puff. This time he only had a small throating cough, then looked over at Jason. Where do you get newspapers from in today's world? It's all online now, David inquired. Jason looked up at him and said, We make them, the organization. We mostly keep low profiles. We don't air out our business to the world. We are loosely cobbled together, each area running its own operation with its own goals. So that means I have no fucking clue what happens in Phoenix or New York. Then how do any of you keep track of anything? Who's in charge of this? Here in this town and its surrounding areas, I do, said Jason. I'm the nex or nexus point here. If my crew learns anything that we think the rest of the organization needs to know, we send it out in newspapers through our runners. The other nexus points do the same. Sometimes people send nothing, because sometimes a job is worth keeping quiet until it is done. But it's how we tell each other whatever we think we need to. Remember that chem farm factory that got blown up just recently? Yeah. In the news they said it was some lone wacko who was unbalanced. It was going to lead to a shortage of Chembal in certain areas, since that was a major site. David replied. Right. I knew it was going to go down about a week before it did. The kid, eh? His name escapes me right now. But he was just like you and many before you. People on the run, people wanting to make a statement or find answers in some cases. If those people make it to us, they aren't expected to join us by any obligation. But if they do, they typically become operatives. The people we send to get shit done. You expect me to be one of them? Asked David. Jason stared at him for a moment, then said, Nah, David, I don't accept anything from anyone. You gotta want it. You gotta be a certain type of person. Like your dad was. The mention of his father sent a fuzzy feeling through David's head. Or was that the nicotine high of a real cigarette? Either way, David jumped right to his next question, abandoning his interest in the newspaper and the organization's structure. Tell me about him, David asked pointedly. Jason sighed. leaned back in the chair, and took a solid puff from his cig. Then he pulled some cheap whiskey out of his desk and poured it into his coffee. How cliché, thought David. Jason took a gulp of the coffee and leaned forward, scratching at the side of his nose as he blew out smoke. He was my hero. He gave me this, he said, pointing at the long scar on his face. He tore your face up and you call him your hero? Asked David, puzzled. Jason just smirked with that shit-eating grin David made note of earlier. It was during a deployment in the year 2026. We were still young men. Our platoon was sent off to some place in South America. Back in the earlier part of the 21st century, we were still busy helping corporations stamp out all competitors, even if they came from some other place. If they were a market or had a leader who didn't want to pay into the system they were building, they wanted it gone. I got hit with some blowback debris and shot up a couple times. If your dad wasn't there, I would have bled out in some other part of the world, all before I was 19 years old. He lost his left ear that day too. David sat there taking that in. His father was a war hero before he was 20. David was 29, and his biggest accomplishment in life so far was when he mouthed off at his neighbor Steve yesterday. What else? He asked, his mouth somewhat dry. Jason stood up, tossed David a pack of smoke so he could smoke freely without asking for more, poured him a cup of the cheap charge station coffee mixed with his cheap whiskey. When we got back, a lot around us changed. The Union was becoming the very thing it wasn't supposed to be, a controlled state pretending to be free. We got into some bad crowds, like a lot of young people back then, using a lot of hard alcohol and undirected anger to ruin ourselves. Had your mom not come around and changed his worldview, we wouldn't be here talking today. David considered his mother, being some light at the end of a tunnel for someone. The woman he knew was a near blank canvas of emotions. His memories were of a mother that was barely able to make food, stared blankly at a screen, and did minimal work at an office job. Then around 2032, after a few years in the fight, it went down. He wanted to make a big statement, wanted to wake people up, thought we could make some big waves. He wanted to hit a power plant, liberate the people inside, film it, and leak all the shit they do in those places to the world. I disagreed and told him it was a suicide run until we could figure out more. We argued. It was bad. He and Eddie put a team of their own together. Then he was gone. Some days I think it was my fault. Others, I don't think of it at all. But before they took your mom off and made her into a veghead, she made me promise I wouldn't force you into this world unless you came to me. I kept that promise and will continue to do so until I hear otherwise. David cracked a smile. Well, it would be hard for her to say otherwise now. She probably barely knows who and what I am at this point. Jason nodded slowly. I'm well aware of her condition, David. David pondered it for a moment. He was allowed to go anywhere and do anything. He wasn't expected to be in this world if he didn't want to. Yet, he knew out there alone he would simply be caught, bagged, and shipped off to either be re-educated or maybe even at this point reassigned, like his old man. Who was to say it would be any different with this group of loosely put-together band of fighting fools? Look at how it worked out for his father, after all. No. The path forward made sense to David. Something told him he only had one true option, maybe the only option he was ever actually meant to have. He looked up at Jason, lit a new cigarette, took a puff, and desperately holding back a cough so he could maintain the element of cool, he said, I can't speak for the girl downstairs, but I'm in next.